Out of all the interviews I've had over the last few years, this question is still my favorite, and I'd argue it's almost fun as far as interview questions go. And I've luckily been on both sides of this question, so I know what mistakes I made when I first saw this problem, and I know what mistakes other candidates tend to make as well. I'll have everything, the completed solution and the starter project linked in the description below, but without further ado, let's get started. So the interview starts with the interviewer sending you this simple Xcode project. You can see that in our main storyboard we have one view controller that just has a stack view pinned to the bottom that contains 4 equal width buttons, all of different colors. And now if we jump into our actual code, we can see that we're not doing a ton. We're just keeping track of which button is pressed, we're grabbing the selected color, and we're just assigning it to a variable so we can keep track of it. And then for the selected button, we are just changing its alpha value so that way we can easily recognize it. Now if I go ahead and run the project, it looks something like this. You can see that when I select one of the buttons, its alpha value changes, but all of the other alpha values for all of the other buttons returns to 1. From here, the interviewer will send you a short video of the functionality that they want you to duplicate. So you can see here in the video that whatever button color was selected below, when we tap on this white area in the UI view, it adds a 50 by 50 pixel square of the selected color at that location. So let's go ahead and work on implementing this. Alright, so let's do this in real time. The first thing we'll need to do is we'll need a way of knowing the location that the user has tapped on the screen. And we can do this by adding a tap gesture recognizer to our view, and we can handle the actual user tap with a handle tap function, which we'll write just in a moment. So for our handle tap function, we need the add Objective-C prefix to expose it to the Objective-C runtime, and in it we're going to go ahead and call our add square function, which will take in the selected color and the location in the view that the user has tapped. And this is kind of like a tricky part of the interview if you don't know that this function exists, but generally the interviewer will kind of give you a hint that this might be a function you want to look for. But let's continue on. So let's go ahead and implement our add square function. We can see that inside we're creating a new UI view. We're passing in the location, so the location the user tapped, and a hard-coded width and height of 50 pixels. From there we're setting the background color and we're adding it to our view. Let's go ahead and run it and make sure that it works as expected. Alright, so now I've selected the orange color and you can see that wherever I've tapped, a square is being added. Perfect. So that's the first step of this interview done. Alright, for the second part of this interview, let's watch this video together. So we can see that now we need to keep track of how many times each color has been shown on the screen before. And we can see that there's a label involved. So most of the time candidates will just add a label to the UI view that they've already made in the add square function, but a UI label inherits from UI view, which means that we would already have access to the background color property just by using a UI label. So we can just change our implementation of add square to use a label instead of a view. And I think that this is one of those things that interviewers are looking for. They want to see that you reevaluate your approach as new information comes in. Alright, so let's go ahead and make those changes. We'll go ahead and convert this from a UI view to a UI label. This line is going to be unchanged. And let's go ahead and do some of the text formatting. So we'll go ahead and say that the square, our text alignment is going to be center. We'll say that the text color is going to be white. So that should match the design of this for the most part. Alright, so next we're going to need some data structure for keeping track of how many times we've added a stamp of a specific color. And the main hesitation here is that not everyone realizes that UI color is hashable, which would allow us to use a dictionary. And when I've been conducting this interview, I've been waiting for candidates to ask this question because I expect them to be talking through their thought process aloud. And sometimes people would create individual counts for each color, but I'm sure you can see why that's not scalable and the code would get really messy. Alright, so let's go ahead and implement this counting requirement. So we'll go ahead and create a dictionary that's going to map UI color, which is hashable again, to an integer count. And then all we have to do is we have to make a small change in our add square function that is just going to check whether or not the number exists in the dictionary. If it does, great, take that number, add 1, and display it. If it doesn't, it'll default to 1. So, for example, we'll check if we have already shown that color on the screen. If we have, we'll update our color count, and we will show in the label the current color count plus 1. Otherwise, we'll default to 1 and we'll store that color. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure it works as expected. All right, so now we can see that it counts appropriately by each color. All right, time for step 3. All right, so we're halfway through. So for this third part of the interview, we can see that we now have a navigation bar with a navigation bar item that introduces this undo functionality. So let's go ahead and try and implement this. All right, so let's go ahead and add this undo button. The first thing I'll do is I'll just go ahead and create this IB action that we'll fill in a moment, and we'll jump over to the storyboard. We'll take our view controller, we'll go ahead and embed it in the navigation controller, so that way we get this navigation bar, and I will add a bar button item to it. I'm going to change its name to undo, and I'm going to give it the undo pressed action that we created before. So now let's start filling this out. We know we're going to need some data structure that's going to keep track of the most recently added stamp onto the screen, and the most obvious answer here is a stack. And we can just use a normal Swift array and the pop last function to get this behavior. So I've gone ahead and I've created this undo labels array, and that's what we're going to use for the rest of this implementation. So now whenever we add a new stamp to the screen, we need to add it to our stack here. So let's go ahead and say undo labels.append this new square label that we've made. Great, but now if we come back to this, this video here, we can see that the initial state has this undo button as disabled. So when there is nothing to undo, we want to disable it, and the moment that there's a stamp on the screen, we want to enable it. So let's add that functionality before we do anything else. All right, since we know we want to change the state of the undo button, let's go ahead and create a reference to it. And now we'll jump over to our storyboard and we will create that connection. Great, so now back in our main view controller, we know we need to create a function that will manage the state of this undo button. So that implementation could look something like this. All this function is doing is it's checking if there are items to remove, go ahead and enable the undo button, otherwise go ahead and disable it. So now we need to call this function in 2 locations. Firstly, every time the user taps on the screen and adds a new label, we need to update the undo button state to make sure that it becomes active if it needs to be. And then also when the view is shown for the first time, right, which will give us the disabled case that we're after. Now let's go ahead and work on the undo pressed implementation. So we need to do a few things here. The first thing we want to do is we want to try and grab that last label from the array if it exists. And then we'll go ahead and update the count of that particular color because again, we're intending to remove this color from the screen. And then once all of that's done, we'll actually go ahead and remove it from the super view and we'll update the undo button state just to make sure that that is still correct. Let's go ahead and run it and make sure that our undo function works as expected. So correctly, it is disabled when the application starts. I'll add a few, undo, 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 perfect. Let's mix up some colors. Perfect. Now we're on to the final piece of this interview. All right, so this final part of this interview introduces this redo button, which is a counterpart of undo. So redo will just re-add whatever label undo took away. So the logic here is going to be pretty simple to what we just did for undo. Whatever we pop off of undo stack, we're going to add to redo and vice versa. Since this feature is so similar to the undo operation that we added before, I've already gone ahead and I've created a bar button item for the undo button and a stack to store the redo operations. So let's jump back down here to our update undo button state function and create one for the redo button state. And you can see that the implementation is identical. All right, now let's go ahead and build out the IB action for the redo pressed function. You can see that the implementation is very similar to what we did for undo pressed. We're going to grab the last element from our stack if it exists. We're going to add that back to the stack for the undo labels. We'll update our count. We'll actually remove that last label and then we'll update the state of those bar button items. In order to complete this implementation, we do need to make one change to our undo pressed function. Whatever we are undoing, we need to add to the redo stack. So let's go ahead and say redo labels.append last label. So whatever we intend to remove from the screen, let's add it to the redo stack so that way we can add it back later if we chose to. Then in our add square function, we also want to update the redo button state as well. And then the same thing up here in our view.load. And one final time in our redo function. Our undo pressed function. Let's go ahead and run this and make sure that we have successfully completed this interview. So I'm going to go ahead and click orange, rate, undo, redo, perfect. Let's bring in some new colors. Undo, redo, perfect. So now we've completed this 4-part interview in around 10 minutes. I've always liked this interview in particular because I think it's a lot more fun than some of the other interviews that I've done. And I think it's really practical about what it's doing. It's a really good way of testing your familiarity with UIKit, gesture recognizers, basic data structures, and algorithms. So I think this is like one of the most fun and practical interviews I've been a part of. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a comment below letting me know. And yeah, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.